When it comes to India's economy, one phrase has frequently been heard in recent years: a golden age of development. With its status as the world's fourth largest economy, impressive growth rates, low inflation, and news of policy incentives and industrial relocation, India's economy appears to be surging ahead with boundless momentum. However, we must take a step back and ask how much substance lies beneath this apparent prosperity. How many pressing challenges remain unresolved? Is India's economic rise, which is being watched around the world, a sustainable long-term leap that will keep it at the forefront of emerging markets, or is it merely a temporary flurry of activity confined to the data? The answers lie in the details of India's policy landscape, industrial practices, and external strategic maneuvers. Today, we will thoroughly examine the current state, strengths and hidden risks of India's economy, presenting everything clearly and comprehensively. First, let's establish one core fact. India has indeed become the world's fourth largest economy. Many may wonder, how was this ranking determined? Are the data reliable? Let's look at some authoritative statistics. According to World Bank data, India's GDP reached $3.638 trillion in 2023. According to the preliminary assessment report released by India's Press Information Bureau in January 2026, India's GDP has surged to $4.18 trillion, officially surpassing Japan to claim fourth position globally. However, it's important to note that this figure of $4.18 trillion is not yet final or audited. The definitive conclusion will only be reached after India's official annual accounting report is released in 2026. Beyond the GDP total, attention is focused on India's economic performance, characterized by high growth and low inflation. In its December 2025 assessment report on India's economy, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) projected that India's real GDP growth rate would reach 6.6% year-on-year during the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year, while inflation would decline to 2.8%. This data is impressive for a global emerging market. The inflation rate is significantly lower than the average for other emerging economies and precisely within the target range set by the Reserve Bank of India. However, we cannot rely solely on surface-level data. Two critical points warrant attention. The first is the controversy surrounding India's GDP measurement system. As we know, GDP calculations require a base year. India currently uses the 2011-12 fiscal year as its base, despite the fact that this is over a decade old. The economic structure has changed significantly since then, so using an outdated base year introduces potential biases. Furthermore, India has a substantial informal economy comprising street vendors, small workshops and individual traders whose output cannot be precisely measured and must be estimated. Consequently, many economists believe that the official growth rate of 6.6% may be inflated, and that the actual growth rate is likely to be closer to 2.5% to 3%. This discrepancy between the reported data and the true situation indirectly highlights the inadequacies of India's economic statistical system and the challenges posed by its disproportionately large informal sector. The second key point is what underpins this high growth, low inflation dynamic. Essentially, it hinges on three pillars: domestic consumption, investment-driven growth, and the resilience of external trade. Firstly, domestic consumption acts as the ballast for India's economic growth. As the world's most populous nation, India's growing middle class is fueling rising purchasing power and robust demand for electronics, automobiles, healthcare, and related services. Statistics indicate that consumption accounts for between 55% and 60% of India's total output, meaning that over half of economic growth is driven by consumer spending. In order to stimulate consumption, the Indian government has introduced various initiatives, most notably the Goods and Services Tax (GST) reform, which was launched on the 22nd of September 2025. This reform simplified the previously complex tax structure and streamlined business registration and compliance processes. The overall effective tax rate has decreased, reducing the operational burden on businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, and indirectly invigorating the consumer market. After all, Lower corporate taxes may make products more affordable, encouraging people to spend more. Beyond urban consumption, rural areas are also gradually unlocking their spending potential. With over half of India's population living in rural areas, the importance of the rural market is clear. In recent years, the Indian government has increased investment in rural infrastructure, such as building roads and water management facilities, while also introducing policies to subsidize farmers and boost rural incomes. Higher incomes naturally fuel greater demand for consumption. There has been rapid growth in demand for durable goods such as refrigerators, washing machines, and motorcycles in the rural market. Currently, the rural market accounts for over 40% of India's total consumption and is emerging as a crucial new driver of consumption growth. However, it must be acknowledged that regional disparities in rural consumption remain pronounced. Rural areas in northern and western India, such as Punjab and Haryana, benefit from developed agriculture and proximity to urban centers, resulting in higher incomes and stronger purchasing power. In contrast, impoverished regions in the southeast, such as Bihar and Chhattisgarh, suffer from poor agricultural conditions and low farmer incomes, leading to weak consumption capacity. Moreover, farmers' incomes depend heavily on agricultural commodity prices. When natural disasters or market fluctuations cause these prices to fall, farmers' incomes are impacted, leading to a corresponding decline in their consumption capacity and leaving them highly vulnerable to risk. This is also a key factor that constrains the further release of India's rural consumption potential. Having discussed consumption, let's now turn to investment, which is another important driver of India's economic growth. Investment in India is primarily divided into two categories: domestic investment and foreign direct investment (FDI). The most pivotal domestic investment policy is the government's production-linked incentive plea scheme. The government designates key industries in which companies receive fiscal subsidies for increasing investment, expanding capacity, and boosting sales. Crucially, subsidy amounts are directly tied to incremental sales. The more a company sells, the greater the subsidy. Since its launch in 2020, the plea scheme has undergone multiple expansions and refinements. It now covers 14 strategic sectors, including electronics, automobiles, new energy vehicles, pharmaceuticals, solar panels, and capital goods. Total incentive expenditure has reached 1.97 trillion rupees, which ranks among the highest in emerging economies. According to the latest data, as of July 2025, the scheme had approved 806 corporate projects. Companies have committed to investing 1.61 trillion rupees, with actual investments reaching 1.76 trillion rupees. Beneficiary enterprises' total sales have surpassed 16.5 trillion rupees. These figures demonstrate the scheme's effectiveness in stimulating investment growth and driving industrial upgrading in India's manufacturing sector. Beyond government-led investments, domestic private investment is gradually recovering. As India's business environment improves through streamlined approvals and reduced tax burdens, private enterprises are regaining confidence in the manufacturing and infrastructure sectors. In Q3 of FY 2025 to 2026, private investment grew by 4.2% year-on-year, an increase of 1.1 percentage points from the previous quarter. While this growth rate is modest, it signals a steady recovery. However, the performance of foreign direct investment (FDI) has been somewhat disappointing compared to domestic investment. In FY 2024 to 25, India's net FDI stood at just $353 million, a striking 96.5% year-on-year decline and a 25-year low. This figure speaks volumes, reflecting the ongoing concerns of multinational corporations regarding India's business environment. What exactly is deterring foreign investors? 3 core issues stand out. First, land acquisition is difficult. India's complex land ownership structure and arduous expropriation procedures frequently lead to social conflicts, compelling companies to invest considerable time and resources in securing suitable land for factory construction. Secondly, there are rigid labor regulations. India's labor laws impose numerous restrictions on hiring and firing employees, limiting corporate flexibility. When the market turns unfavorable, companies face significant challenges in downsizing, which increases operational risks. Thirdly, there are inefficient administrative approvals. Inconsistent policies and fragmented processes across different departments mean businesses often have to navigate multiple agencies to complete a single task, consuming substantial time and resources. Despite the Indian government introducing numerous policies to attract foreign investment, implementation issues persist. Consequently, the scale and quality of foreign capital inflows have both fallen short of expectations. In high-tech sectors in particular, the proportion of foreign investment remains low. Most foreign capital continues to be invested in traditional manufacturing and services, which limits its ability to drive India's industrial upgrading. Next, let's discuss external trade, which is another vital component of India's economy. When considering India's trade, it is evident that its goods exports are not particularly prominent, and it frequently runs trade deficits. This is indeed the case. India has long maintained a goods trade deficit. Fortunately, however, its exports of services perform exceptionally well, partially offsetting the goods trade deficit and supporting the overall resilience of its trade. According to IMF projections, India's merchandise exports are expected to reach approximately $416.3 billion in FY 2025-2026, which represents a year-on-year decline of 5.8%, a growth rate that is less than ideal. However, several sectors stand out within merchandise exports, such as electronics, pharmaceuticals, and textiles. These sectors have experienced relatively robust export growth and form the core pillars of merchandise exports. The services trade sector performed significantly better. During the 2024-25 fiscal year, India's services exports reached $320 billion, marking an impressive year-on-year growth of 8.3%. IT services remain the strongest performer within this sector, accounting for over 60% of total services exports. India's IT outsourcing services are highly competitive on the global stage. Companies such as Tata Consultancy Services and Infosys are world-renowned. IT service providers that undertake substantial outsourcing projects for European and American enterprises, generating significant foreign exchange earnings for India in the process. Beyond IT services, notable growth was also seen in exports of financial services and medical tourism, which served as crucial forces in offsetting the goods trade deficit. However, India's trade now faces significant external pressure in the form of U.S. trade protectionism. Following former U.S. President Trump's return to office in August 2025, a series of protectionist trade policies were implemented, including the imposition of high tariffs on Indian goods. The U.S. had already imposed a 25% reciprocal tariff on certain Indian products, and later added an additional 25%, bringing the total tariff rate to 50%. This undoubtedly dealt a heavy blow to India's exports. It is important to note that the United States is a major trading partner for India. Indian exports to the U.S. are primarily concentrated in labor-intensive industries such as textiles and apparel, jewelry, and agricultural products. These sectors employ a large number of low-skilled workers, so a decline in exports would directly impact domestic employment stability. Forecasts indicate that India's exports to the U.S. will plummet from $87 billion in the 2025 fiscal year to $49.6 billion in the 2026 fiscal year, representing a drop of over 43%. However, it should be noted that U.S. tariffs on Indian goods do not apply to all sectors. Sectors such as pharmaceuticals, electronics, energy, and chemicals remain exempt from tariffs. The adjusted weighted average tariff burden stands at around 34%. Nevertheless, India remains one of the US's most heavily taxed trading partners alongside Brazil and China. Having discussed growth drivers, let's now turn to inflation. As previously mentioned, India's projected inflation rate for FY 2025-26 stands at 2.8%, a notably low figure. Why has this low inflation been achievable? Two primary factors are at play. The first is relatively stable food prices. As an agricultural powerhouse, India's CPI consumer price index is significantly affected by food prices. accounting for around 40%. Therefore, maintaining stable food prices is crucial for controlling overall inflation. In recent years, the Indian government has stabilized the domestic food supply and curbed significant price fluctuations by adjusting import tariffs on agricultural products and improving the grain reserve system. In 2025, India's food prices rose by only 1.2% year-on-year, which is far below the historical average and lays a solid foundation for controlling overall inflation. The second factor stems from the benefits of the Goods and Services Tax (GST) reform. This reform simplified the tax rate structure and reduced the effective tax burden on businesses. This eased operational pressures for enterprises and indirectly lowered prices for downstream goods. For small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs in particular, the tax reduction provided greater flexibility to control product pricing, preventing rising costs from being passed on to consumers. Furthermore, India's ample foreign exchange reserves and stable exchange rate have mitigated the impact of rising import prices on inflation. An IMF report also states that improvements in India's fiscal and financial stability have strengthened its resilience against inflation risks further. However, it is important to note that, although India's overall inflation remains low, regional and structural issues persist. In rural areas, inflation rates exceed those in urban centers, primarily due to higher logistics costs and less developed supply chains, making rural goods more susceptible to price hikes. Structurally, core inflation excluding food and energy prices remains at around 3.5%, which is higher than the overall inflation rate. This indicates persistent price pressures in non-food sectors, particularly as rising service prices contribute increasingly to core inflation. Prices in service sectors such as education, healthcare, and transportation, for instance, have consistently shown high growth rates in recent years, adding pressure to household living costs. In reality, both growth data and inflation performance mask deeper issues and potential risks within India's economy. The first risk stems from the impact of climate change. Approximately 60% of India's farmland lacks irrigation infrastructure and relies entirely on natural precipitation, making the country's agriculture highly dependent on rainfall. Extreme weather events such as droughts or floods can lead to reduced agricultural output, driving up food prices and reigniting inflationary pressures. At the same time, such events reduce farmers' incomes, which dampens rural consumption. In recent years, as global climate change has intensified, India has experienced extreme weather events with increasing frequency. This poses a significant threat to Indian agriculture and the overall economy. A second risk is uncertainty in the global economic environment. The pressure of slowing global economic growth is substantial. The United Nations projects a global growth rate of 2.8% for 2026, while the World Bank and the IMF forecast 2.6% and 3.3% respectively. While the IMF's outlook is relatively optimistic, all institutions emphasize the fragile nature of global growth and the many uncertainties it faces. If the global economy were to enter a recession, external demand would contract, which would inevitably have a more severe impact on India's exports, particularly to major markets such as Europe and the United States. Ongoing geopolitical conflicts, such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict and tensions in the Middle East, will also impact global energy prices and supply chain stability, which would adversely affect India's energy supply and industrial production. The third and most fundamental risk lies in India's deep-seated structural economic issues. Only 9 out of 22 core economic indicators in India have achieved growth, according to statistics. For example, growth in the mining sector has almost stalled, while growth in electricity demand is slowing. This suggests that India's economic recovery has not benefited all sectors of the real economy, resulting in low-quality growth. Furthermore, India's per capita GDP is only around $2,800. Although its total GDP ranks 4th globally, its per capita level remains low. This places India in the transitional phase from a low-income to a middle-income country, a status that is inconsistent with its position as the world's 4th largest economy. This reflects the fact that India's economic growth relies primarily on expanding in size rather than improving in quality. with persistently low per capita income and high poverty rates. India's economic progress to its current stage, reaching what is termed a development inflection point, is no coincidence. At its core lies the synergistic impact of three key policies that act like a three-horse carriage and collectively propel the Indian economy forward. What are these three policies? Firstly, actively signing free trade agreements. Secondly, boosting domestic manufacturing capacity. And thirdly, implementing flexible tariff strategies. Viewed individually, each policy has limited impact. However, when implemented in highly synchronized fashion, they create a synergistic effect, mutually reinforcing and amplifying each other to collectively propel India's economy towards a qualitative breakthrough. First, let's examine the policy of enhancing domestic manufacturing capacity, which is the core of the core. The most crucial lever here is the production-linked incentive plea scheme, which we have repeatedly emphasized. When it was launched in April 2020, the scheme only covered a few sectors: mobile manufacturing, electronic components, and pharmaceutical intermediates. As its effectiveness became evident, the scheme expanded progressively. Today, it encompasses 14 strategic industries, including automobiles and components, textiles, white goods, and specialty steel, with total incentive expenditure reaching 1.97 trillion rupees. According to data released by India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry in December 2025, as of July 2025, the scheme had approved 806 corporate applications, with companies committing to invest 1.61 trillion rupees, with actual completed investments reaching 1.76 trillion rupees. The total sales of beneficiary enterprises exceeded 16.5 trillion rupees, driving the expansion of manufacturing capacity and promoting industrial upgrading. Furthermore, the scheme has generated a significant number of jobs, creating 1.15 million employment opportunities in total. Of these, 176 were small and medium-sized enterprises (SMEs), playing a significant role in stabilizing India's job market. However, it is important to note that the effectiveness of the PLI scheme varies significantly across different industries. Sectors such as electronics and pharmaceuticals have seen significant benefits, while traditional industries such as textiles and automobiles have seen slower results. First, let's look at the electronics industry. Following the launch of the PLI scheme, multinational corporations such as Apple, Xiaomi, and Oppo increased their investments in India by building assembly plants and production bases, which has significantly boosted the country's electronics production capacity. India has now become a major global electronics manufacturing hub, particularly for mobile phones, with explosive growth in both production and exports. The pharmaceutical sector has followed a similar trajectory. The PLI scheme has encouraged Indian drug manufacturers to upgrade their production lines and improve their compliance with Good Manufacturing Practice (GMP), facilitating the industry's transformation from a raw material exporter to a powerhouse of high-end formulations. Previously, India's profits were primarily derived from exporting low-cost APs, which offered slim margins and made the industry vulnerable to international price fluctuations. However, by upgrading production lines to manufacture high-end formulations that meet European and American standards, the industry can now command higher profits and gain greater influence in the global pharmaceutical market. However, the textile industry faces a less optimistic outlook. Textiles remain a traditional pillar industry in India, absorbing significant labor. However, the sector suffers from low concentration, a high proportion of small and micro enterprises, and outdated technology, with many firms still relying on manual or basic mechanical production processes. Consequently, implementation of the PLI scheme in textiles has been sluggish, with both capital disbursement rates and capacity utilization falling short of expectations and failing to drive effective industry-wide upgrading. Beyond this, the PLI scheme faces two additional critical issues. First, delays in funding disbursement. Many enterprises report that incentive payments, which should be received according to the plan, take 18 to 24 months to process. Such prolonged cycles severely disrupt corporate cash flow and dampen investment enthusiasm. Secondly, The approval process is cumbersome. Companies must submit extensive documentation and obtain approvals from multiple departments, which is a complex, time-consuming, and labor-intensive procedure. Many small and medium-sized enterprises (SMEs) abandon their applications due to confusion over the process or an inability to afford the required materials, which further limits the effectiveness of the policy. Having addressed domestic capacity enhancement, we now turn to the second policy initiative of actively pursuing free trade agreements. Why has India suddenly accelerated its pace of signing FTAs? There are two main reasons for this change. First, to counter US tariff pressures. And second, to diversify trade and reduce reliance on any single market. Previously, US protectionist policies imposed steep tariffs on Indian goods. If India had remained solely focused on the US market, its exports would have inevitably suffered significant disruption, making the development of new markets imperative. Prior to this, India had been relatively cautious about signing FTAs, concerned that opening up the market would undermine domestic industries and employment. However, in the face of US tariff pressures, India has had to change its strategy, accelerating FTA negotiations with major global economies. It has successively concluded or advanced FTA talks with multiple countries and regions. A review of recent developments clearly reveals India's strategic approach. In March 2024, India signed the Trade and Economic Partnership Agreement (TEPA) with the European Free Trade Association (EFTA). Although EFTA has only for member states, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, it possesses formidable economic strength. The organization holds unique advantages in high-end manufacturing, financial services, environmental technologies, and other sectors, offering strong economic complementarity with India. The agreement is expected to be fully implemented by the end of 2025. Once implemented, EFTA member states will eliminate tariffs on 99% of goods imported from India, while India will progressively reduce or eliminate tariffs on 96% of goods from EFTA members. This will undoubtedly open the door for India to access Europe's high-end markets. On the 24th of July 2025, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the UK, India and the UK formally signed a bilateral free trade agreement. This agreement is of significant importance and is expected to take effect within 1 year. Under the agreement, 90% of UK exports to India will be subject to reduced tariffs, with 85% achieving zero tariffs within a decade. Conversely, 99% of Indian exports to the UK will be tariff-free. This effectively grants India a passport to the European market, enabling its manufactured goods and services to enter the UK market at lower cost and spread across the entire continent. Beyond the signed agreements, negotiations to upgrade the India-Australia Free Trade Agreement are progressing steadily. In December 2022, India and Australia signed the India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement (ECTA). Since its implementation, this agreement has driven significant growth in bilateral trade, with the trade volume reaching $46 billion in FY 2024-25, an 18% year-on-year increase. Both sides are now advancing efforts to upgrade the ECTA to a comprehensive economic and trade agreement (CETA). The 11th round of negotiations concluded in August 2025, while a final agreement is still pending. The negotiations are aiming to incorporate new areas such as trade in services, digital trade, and rules of origin. Of all the ongoing free trade negotiations, the India-EU talks are the most closely watched. Both sides have long expressed their desire to swiftly conclude an agreement, setting a clear target of doing so by the end of 2025. Although discussions covered 23 areas, ultimately no agreement was reached by the deadline. Where do the core differences lie? There are three main areas. Firstly, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, commonly referred to as the carbon border tax. Secondly, the protection of geographical indications. And thirdly, market access. Let's start with the carbon border tax. The EU officially implemented the CBAM on the 1st of January 2026, requiring imports of high-carbon emission products such as cement, steel, aluminium, and fertilizers to pay carbon fees equivalent to those borne by EU-based companies. This policy covers hundreds of tariff lines in India's exports to the EU. affecting nearly $10 billion worth of exports and directly impacting India's high-carbon industries, such as steel and aluminium production. Notably, India's steel industry predominantly uses coal-fired blast furnaces, resulting in a carbon intensity of 2.55 tons of CO per ton of crude steel, which is significantly higher than the global average of 1.9 tons. Following the EU's implementation of the carbon border tax, Indian steel exports to the EU will incur an additional cost of around $290 per ton. This will severely undermine the international competitiveness of Indian steel products. Consequently, India has joined forces with China, Brazil, and other developing nations in criticizing the EU's policy. They argue that it unfairly shifts the burden of emissions reduction costs onto developing countries, thereby violating the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. However, the EU maintains that this mechanism is central to achieving its climate goals and aims to ensure a level playing field for European companies and imported products. The divergence between the two sides is unlikely to be bridged in the short term, which makes it the biggest obstacle to concluding the India-EU Free Trade Agreement. Beyond the EU negotiations, India is actively expanding its trade cooperation with other regions. For example, the second round of its free trade talks with New Zealand has been completed, achieving significant progress in goods trade, services trade, and investment. The third round is scheduled for 2026. India has also formally launched free trade agreement negotiations with the Eurasian Economic Union (EAEU), which comprises Russia, Armenia, and Belarus. The goal is to establish a long-term institutional framework for trade cooperation to ensure energy and food security. India is also advancing negotiations with resource-rich nations such as the Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC), Chile, and Peru, with the aim of securing energy supplies and expanding trade and investment. This diverse approach to free trade negotiations is highly significant for India. On the one hand, it helps India to reduce its reliance on single markets such as the US and Europe, thereby mitigating trade risks. On the other hand, it enables India to integrate more effectively into global value chains, participate in the shaping of global economic and trade rules, and foster a more favorable external environment for its own economic development. We now turn to the third policy, implementing a flexible tariff strategy. While the PLI scheme represents internal strength and free trade agreements embody external strength, tariff strategy serves as the bridge connecting these two, playing a balancing and coordinating role. India's tariff strategy focuses on selective retention and targeted adjustments, avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, it implements differentiated tariff adjustments based on each industry's developmental stage, strategic importance, and market demand. Specifically, this strategy unfolds in three key scenarios. Firstly, high tariffs are maintained on sensitive sectors such as agriculture and certain traditional manufacturing industries in order to protect domestic industries and employment and prevent cheap foreign products from flooding the domestic market. Secondly, for strategic industries requiring upgrading, such as pharmaceuticals and electronics, targeted tariff reductions are applied to core production equipment and raw materials in order to lower corporate production costs. Thirdly, within the framework of free trade agreements, tariffs on key export products from specific countries and regions are significantly reduced or eliminated to enhance their international competitiveness. First, let's examine the protection of sensitive industries. Agriculture is the most typical example of this. As India's pillar industry, it sustains approximately 60% of the population. Food security and stable farmer incomes directly impact social stability. Consequently, India maintains high tariffs on staple grains such as rice and wheat to prevent large-scale imports from undermining domestic food security and farmer incomes. Meanwhile, flexible tariff adjustments are applied to certain cash crops such as cotton and sugarcane. Import duties are raised or lowered based on domestic market supply conditions in order to balance the interests of producers and consumers. Consider the steel industry as another example. On the 30th of December 2025, India announced a 3-year safeguard duty on imported non-alloy and alloy flat steel products. From the 21st of April 2025 to the 20th of April 2026, the duty rate is 12%, decreasing gradually to 11% over the following 2 years. A minimum price floor of between $675 and $964 per ton was also established. These measures aim to curb the influx of low-priced foreign steel products into the Indian market and safeguard the market share and employment of domestic steel enterprises. The second scenario involves targeted tax reductions for strategic industries to lower corporate costs. The most prominent example is the pharmaceutical sector. In December 2025, India announced its pharmaceutical industry tariff adjustment plan for 2026. Import duties on 4 categories of core high-end equipment, including aseptic injection production equipment, bioreactors and pharmaceutical quality testing instruments, were reduced from 12.3% to 3.5%. Furthermore, companies presenting technical upgrade certification from the Indian Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association are eligible for an additional 5% tax credit. Valid until 2030, core equipment essential for GMP compliance certification remains duty-free. These changes are expected to save the pharmaceutical industry over $68 million each year, enabling companies to upgrade their production lines, align more quickly with European and American drug manufacturing standards, and increase exports of high-end formulations. In the edible oil sector, India, the world's largest importer of vegetable oils, announced on the 30th of May 2025 a reduction in import duties from 20% to 10%. Crude palm oil, crude soybean oil, and crude sunflower oil now face a base import tax rate of 10%, with the combined rate falling to 16.5% once additional levies are applied. This move aims to reduce import costs for raw oils, stimulate domestic oil processing industries, and ease the pressure on rising domestic food prices. Notably, import tariffs on refined vegetable oils remain high at 35.75%, establishing a differentiated structure of lower taxes on raw materials and higher taxes on finished products. This approach safeguards the domestic market supply while protecting the interests of local refining enterprises. This demonstrates the flexibility of India's tariff strategy. A third scenario involves reducing tariffs on key export products under free trade agreement frameworks. For example, under the India-Australia FTA, India granted zero tariff access to over 100 Australian exports, including textiles, leather goods, and engineering products. Leveraging cost advantages and tariff benefits, these products have steadily increased their market share in Australia. Similarly, the India-UK FTA has made it easier for India's competitive sectors, such as IT and financial services, to access the market, significantly reducing export costs and enhancing competitiveness in European markets. However, some may question whether India's differentiated tariff strategy constitutes trade protectionism. In fact, it does not. It is a highly pragmatic trade policy that fundamentally embodies reglobalization, not rejecting globalization, but rather leveraging tariff adjustments and FTAs to build a more resilient, global supply chain and trade network that better aligns with India's national interests. On the one hand, it protects sensitive industries in order to stabilize domestic employment and industrial foundations. On the other hand, it promotes exports from competitive sectors through tariff reductions and FTAs, guiding industrial upgrading to achieve dual goals: import substitution and export acceleration. The synergistic effects of these 3 policies are particularly evident in specific industries, with the electronics sector being the most illustrative example. Firstly, the production-linked incentive plea scheme has attracted companies such as Apple and Xiaomi to set up factories in India, thereby expanding production capacity and establishing an industrial ecosystem involving almost 45 suppliers. Secondly, free trade agreements with multiple countries have enabled Indian-made electronics, such as smartphones, to enter overseas markets with zero or low tariffs, thereby driving export growth. Finally, government tariff concessions on electronic components and production equipment reduced corporate production, cost and enhanced product price competitiveness. Data shows that India's electronics exports reached $47 billion in 2025, marking a 37% year-on-year increase. Smartphone exports alone accounted for $30 billion, with iPhone exports totaling $2.03 trillion, approximately $23.1 billion. India now accounts for 20% of global iPhone production capacity, establishing itself as the world's second-largest mobile phone manufacturer. It has transformed from a peripheral assembly location into a core global production hub. However, it must be noted that the synergistic effects of these three policies have created significant regional imbalances. Regions such as southern Karnataka and western Maharashtra, with their robust industrial bases, convenient transportation, and relatively favorable business environments, have become the main beneficiaries of these policies, attracting the majority of investments and project implementations. In contrast, the northern and eastern regions, which are characterized by weak industrial foundations, inadequate infrastructure, and lower labor skill levels, have seen relatively limited policy outcomes. This has further widened the economic development gap between regions. Furthermore, policy fragmentation across different departments and inconsistent approval processes hinder the realization of these synergistic effects. Businesses often face multiple obstacles and must navigate various departments to access policy benefits, which significantly diminishes the effectiveness of certain initiatives. Having covered these three core policies, let's now take a closer look at the current state of India's domestic manufacturing sector. As previously mentioned, the production-linked incentive plea scheme and global supply chain restructuring are the two main drivers of India's manufacturing capacity expansion. These dual forces interact synergistically, enabling India's manufacturing sector to transition from scale expansion to quality enhancement and thereby solidifying its increasingly pivotal role in the global manufacturing landscape. First, let's examine the electronics manufacturing sector, the fastest growing and most successful segment of India's manufacturing industry. Following the launch of the PLI scheme, globally renowned smartphone brands such as Apple, Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo have increased their investment in India significantly, establishing assembly plants and production bases. By the end of 2025, Apple will have 5 operational assembly plants in India, 3 operated by the Indian conglomerate Tata Group and 2 by Foxconn, forming an industrial ecosystem encompassing nearly 45 suppliers. Furthermore, India's smartphone production has evolved beyond entry-level models to include the entire product line, including the Pro series. In 2024, Apple began the process of introducing the base model iPhone 17 in India, demonstrating the country's ability to mass-produce advanced models and signaling a shift in its role from a mere assembly base to a more significant manufacturing hub. Beyond Apple, contract manufacturing giants such as Foxconn and Pegatron are also increasing their investment in India. Hanhai, Foxconn's parent company, has invested $1.5 billion through its Singapore subsidiary to increase production capacity. Its new facility in Bangalore is projected to have an annual production capacity of between 25 and 30 million units. Data indicates that India's electronics exports reached $47 billion in 2025, marking a 37% year-on-year increase. Smartphone exports accounted for $30 billion, with iPhone exports surging by 85% to reach $2.03 trillion. India now accounts for 20% of global iPhone production, making it the world's second-largest mobile phone manufacturer after China. These figures demonstrate the remarkably impressive growth of India's electronics manufacturing sector. However, we must look beyond the surface prosperity. A critical issue facing India's electronics manufacturing is its extreme dependence on imported core components. Statistics show that almost 2/3 of India's electronic components come from China, including core assemblies such as circuit boards, batteries, chips, camera modules, and displays. Even Indian-manufactured smartphones rely heavily on Chinese imports for critical components, with local parts achieving only a 35% localization rate, far below the Indian government's 60% target for 2027. This heavy import dependency creates 2 major risks. Firstly, it increases production costs for companies as importing components incurs tariffs, freight charges, and exposure to exchange rate volatility. Secondly, it makes the industry vulnerable to supply chain disruption. Should international circumstances change, such as escalating trade friction, the supply of core components could be disrupted, which would jeopardize the stable development of the entire sector. Furthermore, India's electronics manufacturing lags significantly behind China in terms of production efficiency and yield rates. Indian factories achieve an average yield rate of around 85%, whereas Foxconn in Zhengzhou reaches 98%, a difference of around 10 percentage points. Indian workers' productivity is only around 60% of that of their Chinese counterparts, primarily due to inconsistent skill levels and insufficient production management experience. These issues prevent India's electronics manufacturing sector from upgrading further. Moving beyond electronics manufacturing, let's examine the new energy vehicle NEV industry. Given the rapid global expansion of the NEV market, India has prioritized this sector. The production-linked incentive plea scheme offers sales incentives of up to 18%, attracting significant corporate investment. One of the most prominent players is India's own Tata Motors. By 2025, Tata's electric vehicle sales had surged by 150% year-on-year, securing them the top market share in India. The company has launched multiple best-selling models, covering both the low-end and mid-range segments. However, Tesla's much-anticipated investment plans in India ultimately failed to materialize. The company had considered building a gigafactory in India, but abandoned the proposal due to challenges including difficulties acquiring land, rigid labor regulations, and unstable tariff policies. Nevertheless, Tesla chose to enter the Indian market despite the high tariffs. In July 2025, Tesla opened its first experience center in Mumbai, selling vehicles exclusively supplied by its Shanghai gigafactory in China. Tesla's experience highlights the significant shortcomings of India's manufacturing sector in attracting high-end investment from multinational corporations. Beyond the challenges of corporate investment, India's new energy vehicle industry faces two significant weaknesses. First, inadequate charging infrastructure. There are very few charging stations in India, and they are distributed unevenly, primarily being concentrated in major cities. Rural and remote areas lack charging facilities, which severely dampens consumer willingness to purchase new energy vehicles. Secondly, there is insufficient battery supply. India's battery production capacity is insufficient, with most batteries relying on imports. Batteries account for 40 to 50% of the total cost of new energy vehicles. This dependency on imports not only increases production costs, but also hinders the rapid development of the new energy vehicle industry. Next, let's discuss the pharmaceutical industry, one of India's traditional strengths. India is one of the world's largest exporters of generic drugs, accounting for over 20% of the global market. Following the launch of the PLI scheme, Indian pharmaceutical companies have upgraded production lines and enhanced GMP compliance, driving the industry's transition from exporting active pharmaceutical ingredients APIs to exporting high-end formulations. In FY 2024 to 2025, India's API exports reached 22.8 billion, transforming the country from a net importer to a net exporter. The proportion of exports of high-end formulations also increased from 20% to 35%. The states of Gujarat and Maharashtra serve as India's core pharmaceutical production hubs. Leading enterprises in these regions have already planned upgrades to production lines and expanded biopharmaceutical capacity to meet stringent European and American standards. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of India projects that reductions in core equipment tax will save the industry as a whole over $68 million annually. These savings could be reinvested in R&D to improve product quality and global competitiveness. Looking ahead, India's pharmaceutical sector aims to transition from being a generic drug powerhouse to becoming an innovative drug leader, thereby securing a greater market share in high-end sectors such as biopharmaceuticals and novel therapeutics. In addition to electronics, new energy vehicles, and pharmaceuticals, the restructuring of the global supply chain also presents development opportunities for other manufacturing sectors in India. Following the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, multinational corporations recognize the risks of over-reliance on a single country for supply chains, driving a push for diversification. India, with its stable political environment, vast consumer market, abundant labor force, and favorable policies, has emerged as a prime destination for industrial relocation. For example, multinationals such as Intel and Samsung have recently established operations in the previously underdeveloped area of semiconductor manufacturing. Intel plans to invest $2.5 billion in building a chip packaging and testing facility, while Samsung intends to invest $17 billion in establishing a semiconductor manufacturing plant. These investments will help to develop India's semiconductor industry, filling the gap in this sector and enhancing the core competitiveness of its domestic manufacturing. Another example is the automotive components sector. Approximately 40% of parts within India's automotive supply chain originate from China. Even Tata Motors, India's largest car manufacturer, relies on imported electric vehicle battery packs from China. However, as global supply chains undergo restructuring, some automotive component manufacturers are shifting production capacity to India. This will increase the localization rate of automotive components in India and reduce dependence on China. Industrial relocation brings capital and technology to India, as well as creating substantial employment opportunities. According to a survey report by the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry (FICCI), in January 2026, 91% of manufacturing enterprises reported stable or growing production levels in the third quarter of the 2025-26 fiscal year. Furthermore, 86% anticipated increased future orders and 38% plan to hire more employees within the next 3 months, which is an increase from 35% during the same period the previous year. This vibrant job market further stimulates domestic consumption. Creating a virtuous cycle of investment growth gives capacity expansion, gives employment increase, gives consumption expansion that provides sustained momentum for India's economic growth. Simultaneously, industrial relocation introduces advanced production management expertise and technology, helping to elevate the operational management standards and technological innovation capabilities of Indian enterprises, and driving the overall upgrading and optimization of the manufacturing sector. For example, after setting up a factory in India, Foxconn introduced advanced production technology and implemented mature production management models, driving the development and progress of surrounding suppliers. However, it is important to recognize that India's manufacturing sector still faces significant challenges. Beyond the previously mentioned issues of reliance on imported core components, low production efficiency, and poor yield rates, 3 other problems are particularly severe. The first is inadequate infrastructure. India's transportation network is severely underdeveloped, with inefficiencies in road, rail, and port logistics resulting in lengthy transit times and high shipping costs. For example, India's highway mileage is only around 1/10 that of China, and many roads are poor quality. Port handling efficiency also lags far behind that in countries such as China and Singapore, often leading to cargo dwell times that are significantly longer than in China. This infrastructure lag directly fuels India's persistently high logistics costs. Statistics show that logistics expenses account for an astonishing 14 to 18% of India's GDP, compared to just 8 to 10% in countries such as China and the United States, a substantial difference. These elevated logistics costs increase production and operational expenses for businesses, and diminish the international competitiveness of products. Many companies have been forced to abandon plans to expand production capacity due to the high cost of logistics. A second challenge is the uneven skill level of the workforce. Although India has a large labor pool and a clear demographic dividend, the overall skill level of its workforce remains low. This is particularly evident in high-end manufacturing sectors such as semiconductors, electronics, and new energy, where there is a severe shortage of highly skilled technical personnel and a significant talent shortage. According to McKinsey's 2024 data, 78% of India's top AI talent migrates to the United States, with 80% of AI professionals working for Western companies. Fewer than 10% remain in India for original R&D. In healthcare, around 70,000 doctors trained in India now work in developed countries such as the US and the UK, while India's doctor-to-patient ratio remains well below the standards set by the World Health Organization. The talent shortage in STEM science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields further hinders India's manufacturing upgrades and technological innovation. By 2025, India's AI talent deficit is projected to reach 1 million, far beyond what domestic universities can fill. The third challenge is rigid labor regulations. India's labor laws impose numerous restrictions on hiring and firing, severely limiting corporate flexibility. For example, companies must navigate complex approval processes and pay substantial severance packages when making staff cuts. Working hours and overtime systems are also subject to strict regulations. While these laws do protect workers' rights to some extent, they also increase operational risks and costs for businesses, which dampens investment enthusiasm. Many multinational corporations consider India's rigid labor regulations to be a key factor when evaluating investment opportunities. Having covered these points, we have now outlined the core aspects of India's economic landscape. Finally, let's summarize. Will opportunities outweigh challenges for India's economy in 2026, or will challenges dominate opportunities? The answer is clear. Opportunities and challenges coexist, and their interplay is intensely competitive. First, the opportunities. India's economic prospects manifest primarily in three areas. Firstly, there is the continued release of policy dividends. Secondly, the synergistic effects of the production-linked incentive plea scheme. Free trade agreements (FTAs) and flexible tariffs will materialize further, driving export growth, foreign capital inflows, and manufacturing job creation. Although foreign direct investment (FDI) inflows have slowed recently, the implementation of a series of FTAs and the gradual improvement of the business environment are expected to lead to a gradual rebound in foreign capital inflows into strategic sectors such as electronics, semiconductors, and new energy. Secondly, India's structural economic advantages are becoming increasingly evident. As the world's fourth-largest economy, India has a vast domestic market and a demographic dividend. Its expanding middle class and evident trend of upgrading consumption drives sustained growth in demand for electronics, automobiles, healthcare, and other sectors. This provides robust support for domestic demand and economic expansion. India also maintains traditional strengths in IT services, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and other industries through industrial upgrading and technological innovation. These advantages will be further solidified, continuously enhancing competitiveness. Thirdly, the benefits of industrial relocation driven by global supply chain restructuring will continue to be realized. The trend of multinational corporations seeking to diversify their supply chains remains unchanged. Leveraging its inherent strengths, India will remain a key destination for industrial relocation. This will bring increased capital, technology, and employment opportunities, driving upgrades to the manufacturing sector and economic growth. However, India's economy faces severe challenges in four key areas. Firstly, the risk of a global economic recession persists, with significant pressure arising from shrinking external demand. If the global economy were to enter a recession, India's exports, particularly to major markets such as Europe and the United States, would be severely impacted, which would have a substantial negative effect on India's economic growth. Secondly, uncertainty surrounding U.S. trade protectionism is unlikely to dissipate in the short term. The United States' imposition of high tariffs on Indian goods has already led to a sharp decline in India's exports to the U.S., and trade negotiations between the two countries have reached an impasse, making it difficult to reach an agreement in the short term. If the United States were to expand the scope of tariff increases further and impose tariff sanctions on India's competitive industries, such as pharmaceuticals and electronics, India's economic growth would face even greater pressure. Thirdly, shortcomings in infrastructure and a lack of high-end talent are difficult to remedy in the short term. Infrastructure development requires substantial capital and time. Although the Indian government is increasing investment in infrastructure, fiscal constraints limit the scale of funding. making it difficult to alter the current state of infrastructure fundamentally in the short term. The shortage of high-end talent also necessitates long-term investment in education and optimization of talent policies, which cannot be resolved quickly. This will hinder the development of India's manufacturing sector and technological innovation. Fourthly, product quality and brand building require improvement. Indian products have long suffered from inconsistent quality and low brand recognition in international markets. For example, in 2024, around 15% of India's exported pharmaceutical preparations were returned due to compliance issues. In the electronics sector, iPhones manufactured in India have a yield rate that is about 10 percentage points lower than those produced in Chinese factories. Ultimately, enhancing export competitiveness depends on improving product quality and brand building rather than relying solely on tariff advantages. This is a critical area in which India must make breakthroughs for its future economic development. Overall, India's golden development period is not without its flaws. Beneath the surface prosperity, numerous deep-seated issues and hidden risks lurk. Whether India can stabilize its position as the world's fourth-largest economy and transition from quantitative to quality growth hinges on its ability to resolve the underlying problems concealed behind the data. These include improving the GDP statistical system, optimizing the business environment, strengthening infrastructure development, cultivating high-end talent, and enhancing product quality and brand influence. 2026 is a pivotal year for India. Seizing opportunities and tackling challenges could propel its economy towards sustained breakthroughs and truly establish it as a leader among emerging markets. Conversely, missing these opportunities and allowing problems to accumulate may render the so-called golden development period merely a temporary boom, unlikely to endure. India's economic development trajectory not only shapes its own future, but also influences the global economic landscape and the direction of emerging markets. Indeed, India's economic journey mirrors the common challenges faced by many emerging economies, such as balancing scale expansion with quality improvement, reconciling domestic industry protection with global cooperation, and addressing infrastructure and talent gaps. India's experiences, both successes and failures, offer valuable insights for other emerging economies. Finally, we can make a preliminary assessment. Over the coming years, India's economy will continue to grow, albeit at a moderating pace, with an improving quality of growth. If India can persistently advance reforms, optimize its business environment, and address its infrastructure and talent gaps, its economic growth will become more resilient and sustainable. Conversely, if reforms stall and problems accumulate, the Indian economy may face greater downward pressure. Either way, India's economic trajectory warrants our sustained attention, as it profoundly shapes the global economic landscape and future development direction.